Is there a better time to be talking about the issue of the abolition of nuclear weapons given the world situation? I think not. So, former judge of the International Court of Justice, Judge Mohammed Benjawi, said this, that the nuclear weapons are the ultimate evil. He went on to say that nuclear weapons destabilize the whole concept of humanitarian law. And for far too long, nuclear weapons have been defended, and that the possession of these weapons has been defended by the nuclear armed nations on the grounds that they are essential to our security and they are important to this concept of deterrence and thus preventing nuclear weapons, while ignoring, as he says, and marginalizing the whole notion that of the moral argument against the use and possession of nuclear weapons. Of the 122 nations recently have approved a treaty to ban nuclear weapons in the UN. And I think you all have heard about that. So predictably, unfortunately, the United States and other nuclear armed nations have rejected the treaty. But there is hope that civil society, that the citizens of the world will rally together and support this treaty and call for a demand that nuclear weapons end, that their countries join together and ratify that treaty. John F. Kennedy said it best in 1961 before the United Nations when he said this: "Every man, woman, and child lives under a sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or madness." So to help us understand and dig deeper in these issues and look at more closely the treaty on banning the bomb, its meaning in the real world, and whether there is any hope in the future that the United States, China, Russia, and the other nuclear armed nations will come to realize the necessity of ratifying that treaty, and to looking at the role that Veterans for Peace is playing now and what we can do in the future to support our founding mission statement of ultimately seeking the elimination of nuclear weapons. What can we continue to do today? I think we're doing what we need to do, and that is with the Golden Rule and our campaign to ban the bomb. But we're going to hear more about that, and I want to introduce to you first today, our first speaker will be Andrew Lichterman. Andrew is a lawyer activist who served in various capacities at the Western States Legal Foundation since 1983. He served on its board since 1985. His writings have appeared in a variety of venues, from local newspaper op-eds to the United Nations Disarmament Institute's Disarmament Forum. In recent years, he has worked his focus on the purpose and the impacts of U.S. nuclear and other strategic weapons programs, including their effect on global disarmament efforts and the relationship between nuclear technologies, militarism, and global economy. So please join in welcoming Andrew Lichterman.
So I want to begin by saying that I appreciate any chance I get to work with Veterans for Peace, one of the truly indispensable organizations in the peace movement. And as someone whose main focus for many years has been nuclear disarmament, I'm thrilled to see that Veterans for Peace, with its national membership and its core of longtime activists, is renewing its dedication to the elimination of nuclear weapons with its various work, including this great Golden Rule project. So I was asked to talk about the nuclear weapons ban treaty that was negotiated at the United Nations in New York last month, and to place it in a bit of a broader context. And I'm going to start with a brief review of current nuclear arsenals and their modernization. And then I'll talk about what the treaty does and also what it doesn't do. And I'll close with some thoughts about the place of the ban treaty in nuclear disarmament work going forward, and also about the kinds of movements I think we'll need to make disarmament progress that's really meaningful possible. So I would note at the outset that we're in a moment that is not easy to understand and a moment of quickening change. In the United States and Europe, economic stagnation and deepening polarization of wealth have eroded the post-World War II political alignments to the point of collapse. The relative decline of the US economy, the rise of new powers, and the determination of incumbent elites to hold on to their power and privilege has created conditions where the risk of war among nuclear-armed countries once more is on the rise. The rapid deterioration of the ecosystems we all depend on, with global warming being only one piece of a larger picture, already is intensifying conflicts large and small. For all of these reasons, we're likely moving into away from a long period of low social mobilization, largely devoid of mass social movements, into a period of higher social mobilization. So our habits of work, our forms of organization, and even the skills and knowledge we each have found useful over the past quarter century or more, all are going to have to be reevaluated in light of the changes that are coming. 35 years ago, in a collection of essays intended to spark debate about the nuclear dilemma of that time, the English social historian and disarmament activist E.P. Thompson wrote, "We are in the end of an epoch where every old category begins to have a hollow sound, and we are groping in the dusk to discover the new." We're in a moment like that again, and I was very struck by David Bender's phrase this morning about building elastic social movements. That's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to be ready to reflect and change and be really ready to meet the moment. So all I can offer here are some pieces of the puzzle which perhaps can be put together with pieces others might offer to assemble something of a larger picture. And I'm really looking forward to attending other sessions here over the next several days where I can learn from others who are engaged in various kinds of work, various pieces of the puzzle around the country. So first, a brief look at how many nuclear weapons are still out there and who has them. So after a rapid drawdown in the 1990s from the rubble-bouncing arsenals of the Cold War, what progress there had been on disarmament slowed to a stop in the 2000s. The last treaty controlling nuclear weapons, the New START Treaty that entered into force in 2011, did not require the destruction of a single bomb or warhead and placed no controls on the development of nuclear weapons with new capabilities. It left thousands of nuclear weapons in service, still enough to destroy human civilization several times over. The United States and Russia, taken together, possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. The United States has about 4,000 and Russia about 4,500 in their active and reserve arsenals, with thousands more so-called retired weapons awaiting dismantlement, which may or may not happen. China, France, and England each have between 200 and 300 nuclear bombs and warheads. India and Pakistan are estimated to have about 120 to 140 apiece. Israel is estimated to have about 80. The estimates for North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities vary widely and now virtually by the day. The Washington Post reported this week that North Korea has as many as 60 nuclear weapons. Independent analysts, and that includes people like an ex-director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, placed the number closer to 20, and there is as yet no open source information showing that it has any deployed, deliverable nuclear weapons. So what do these numbers really mean? To meet the New START Treaty limits, for example, the number of missile tubes on a single ballistic missile submarine are being reduced to 20. independent experts estimate that each missile carries somewhere between 3 and 6 warheads, averaging between 4 and 5. So that's 80 to 100 nuclear warheads per boat. U.S. has 14 ballistic missile submarines, 12 operational, and 8 to 10 at sea at any given time. Now, General George Lee Butler, who's the retired commander of U.S. Strategic Command, emphasizes that it is imperative to recognize that all numbers of nuclear weapons above 0 are completely arbitrary, that against an urban target, one weapon represents an unacceptable horror. 20 weapons would suffice to destroy the 12 largest Russian cities with a total population of 25 million people, then 1/6 of the entire Russian population, still probably about the same or perhaps a bit more. And therefore that arsenals in the hundreds, much less in the thousands, can serve no meaningful strategic objective. Further, climate experts estimate that a limited regional nuclear war in which 100 nuclear weapons were used could severely disrupt global climate for as much as a decade, causing crop failures and famines affecting up to 2 billion people. All of the nuclear weapon states are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, manifesting the intention to sustain them for many decades to come. And the nuclear-armed countries are not just replacing the nuclear weapons they already have, but upgrading them to give them new capabilities. Our own government plans to modernize all 3 legs of the so-called nuclear triad: new ballistic missile submarines, long-range nuclear-capable bombers and air-launched cruise missiles, and concepts to modernize or replace the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles, all are on the drawing board. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that modernizing the U.S. nuclear arsenals, including delivery systems, command and control facilities, and the research labs and factories that support it all, will cost about $400 billion just over the next decade. And it's likely to cost over $1 trillion over 30 years. And we all know how these programs go. They only grow. These programs are not an initiative of this new administration. They are a continuation of long-standing efforts dating back to the Clinton years, when the initial decisions were made to recommit to nuclear weapons despite the end of the Cold War. Modernization efforts already in progress included an upgraded nuclear bomb, the B-6112, that will have significantly greater accuracy and a range of relatively low yields. This would make the bomb a more usable nuclear weapon, one that lowers the fire break between conventional and nuclear war. In addition, the warheads carried by submarine-launched ballistic missiles are being upgraded to give them an improved capability to hit hardened targets like missile silos and command centers. The authors of an in-depth piece about this development in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists concluded that the growing capability of U.S. forward-deployed sea-based nuclear missiles could raise serious questions in the minds of Russian military planners and political leadership about U.S. intentions, especially when seen in the context of growing U.S. cyber, advanced conventional, and missile defense capabilities, almost certainly deepening mistrust and encouraging worst-case planning assumptions in Moscow. These new systems create new instabilities and unknowns in confrontations among nuclear-armed countries. So these advances in nuclear weaponry are occurring in the context of a ramp-up of general high-tech arms racing. Powerful, accurate, stealthy, long-range strike systems face sophisticated air defenses and increasingly capable missile defenses, all in a fog of electronic countermeasures, jamming, and now cyber warfare, operating at a pace that defies human comprehension. With the increased dependence of militaries, and particularly the U.S. military, on satellites for a wide range of military functions, we also can expect intensified military competition in space. A nuclear war is not likely to happen as the result of a bolt-from-the-blue attack. It will happen when the rulers of one or another nuclear-armed state miscalculates the interests and the fears of another, pushing some geopolitical gambit to the point where economic pressures, covert actions, low-level warfare, and displays of high-tech force spiral out of control, escalating into general war. As the first decade of the 21st century passed into the second, the nuclear weapons-free countries, watching all this just continue to unfold, grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of meaningful progress towards disarmament. The non-nuclear armed states saw the maintenance and constant modernization of these nuclear arsenals, still large enough, again, to threaten all civilization, as a breach of the nuclear armed states' obligation under Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, always a mouthful, to negotiate in good faith for the elimination of their nuclear weapons. At the 2015 NPT review conference, the South African ambassador really summed up their frustration. He said, when South Africa put forward the proposal for the indefinite extension of the NPT, that was in 1995, we did not think that 20 years on we would remain in the very same place as far as nuclear disarmament was concerned. We must recall the original grand bargain stated that those who have nuclear weapons will give them up in return for the rest of us providing a guarantee that we will never, ever acquire nuclear weapons. The question remains, when will we achieve the objective of this grand bargain in relation to nuclear disarmament? When will we achieve the total elimination of all nuclear weapons? So, looking for an alternative to traditional disarmament forums like the NPT that appeared to be permanently deadlocked, largely by the presence of the nuclear-armed states, a large group of countries initiated negotiations for a treaty banning nuclear weapons, whether or not the nuclear-armed states chose to participate. Now, there are episodes, short series of events, that capture larger realities. The moment in which the final ban treaty negotiations took place, I think, was one such moment. For 3 weeks in late June and early July of this year, nuclear disarmament activists and diplomats met in New York with years-long activist campaigns, treaty negotiations, and confrontations among nuclear-armed states converging and conflicting at the United Nations. These events together reveal a lot about the current state of nuclear politics. The ban treaty, formally titled the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, was the outcome of two intertwined processes. The first was a campaign by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, a coalition of non-governmental organizations with some funding from friendly governments. And the second was a series of government conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons convened by the nuclear weapons-free countries. The governments, meeting both in the conferences on humanitarian impacts and in the ban treaty negotiations themselves, allowed a notably unusual amount of participation by non-governmental organizations. And the ban treaty doesn't become binding on the countries that join it until 90 days after the 50th country has joined, but that's likely to happen fairly quickly as 122 countries voted to approve the treaty text this July. And the treaty opens for signature September 20th, this fall. The central obligations of the ban treaty are very strong. It prohibits all activities related to the development, manufacture, possession, and use of nuclear weapons. It is particularly noteworthy that the treaty prohibits not only the use of nuclear weapons, but the threat of use. This provision prohibits nuclear deterrence, which intrinsically involves the threatened use of nuclear weapons. The treaty prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons on the territory of a treaty party and lending assistance to anyone to engage in any other prohibited activity. The treaty also prohibits transfer of use or control of nuclear weapons. Taken together, these provisions effectively prohibit participation by treaty parties in joint nuclear weapons planning and dependence on nuclear weapons of the kind currently practiced by NATO and other similar nuclear umbrella relationships. The treaty also provides procedures governing how nuclear-armed states could join the treaty once they were firmly committed to eliminating their nuclear arsenals. Finally, the preamble to the treaty has strong language recognizing the treaty to be in large part an affirmation of existing international law principles. For example, considering that any use of nuclear weapons would be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, in particular the principles and rules of international humanitarian law, reaffirming that any use of nuclear weapons would also be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. The scene around the United Nations during the closing week of the ban treaty negotiations, however, pointed up the fact that for the foreseeable future, when it comes to nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, we will continue to live in a two-tier world. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom immediately issued a joint statement rejecting the treaty, declaring that, quotes, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom and the United States have not taken part in the negotiation of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to it. They also rejected any possibility that the treaty might build on or reinforce customary international law norms against nuclear weapons, declaring that we would not accept any claim that this treaty reflects or in any way contributes to the development of customary international law. And during the very moments that the ban treaty was being finalized, the United States was making it clear that it reserved the right to preserve the two-tier nuclear order by unilateral military action rather than by eliminating it once and for all by a lawful negotiated path to the elimination of nuclear weapons. On July 5th, delegations were meeting in a conference room on the basement floor of the United Nations to put the finishing touches on the ban treaty's language. In the Security Council chambers just 2 floors above, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley was responding to North Korea's ICBM test, declaring that, quotes, the United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. With the nuclear-armed states united in their opposition to disarmament, it will be a long road to the elimination of nuclear arsenals via a route that is still largely uncharted. One might ask why the countries that don't have nuclear weapons thought an agreement negotiated in the absence of those that still brandish them was worth the effort. They did so because they know that the effects of nuclear warfare know no boundaries and make no distinction between soldiers and civilians. They did so because they know that any large-scale nuclear war would endanger the lives of hundreds of millions of human beings, and that nuclear war among the most powerful countries would threaten the foundations of all human civilization. And they did so because they know, and we all should know, that a crisis like the one now growing in Northeast Asia could leap from a spark to an uncontrollable conflagration in unanticipated ways. Now, despite the rejection of the ban treaty and its principles by the nuclear-armed states, The treaty constitutes an important affirmation of the norms against nuclear weapons possession and use. The ban treaty and the series of conferences leading up to it have raised the awareness of a new generation of activists about the catastrophic effects of nuclear warfare. It will continue to provide opportunities for raising public awareness about the dangers nuclear weapons pose. Such opportunities in the near term include the opening of the treaty for signature this fall, again, the 20th of September, and the point where 50 countries have joined and the treaty enters into force for those treaty parties. The treaty also could provide some new ways for nuclear weapons-free governments to exert pressure on the nuclear-armed states. Article 12 of the treaty, for example, requires that each party shall encourage parties not party to this treaty to ratify, accept, approve, or accede to the treaty with the goal of universal adherence of all states to the treaty. Now, this provision suggests that the countries that become parties to the ban treaty should make disarmament diplomacy a constant and visible part of their international stance, including challenging the nuclear-armed states to take concrete steps towards eliminating their nuclear arsenals. But it is important to keep in mind that a convention banning nuclear weapons will bind only those countries that join it. And so far, the nuclear-armed states and their leading allies have stood in opposition. Almost half of the world's population lives in countries that have nuclear weapons. Those countries account for over half of world gross domestic product. If you add in 6 leading countries that have military alliances with the nuclear-armed United States, this being Germany, Italy, Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, you have over half the world's population, accounting for over 70% of the world's GDP. And so far, the humanitarian conferences on the effects of nuclear weapons and the ban treaty process itself have not sparked mass movements for disarmament, either in the countries that negotiated the ban treaty or in the nuclear-armed states and their leading allies. And in the work of nuclear abolition, ultimately, the ban treaty is only a tool, and it can be no stronger than the hands that wield it. It remains to be seen how much political capital the nuclear weapons-free countries that negotiated the ban treaty will be willing to invest to put pressure on the nuclear-armed states. In the absence of sustained demands for disarmament from below, it is hard to envision the countries of the governments of the world's less powerful and, for the most part, poorer countries risking other foreign policy priorities to really push hard for disarmament. And for there to be substantial progress towards nuclear disarmament, we will need mass movements in the nuclear-armed countries most of all. Large-scale opposition to nuclear weapons here in the United States is likely to come about only as a part of a broader peace movement, one that can work together with other emerging movements by focusing on the common causes of the dangers and injustices we all seek to end. But at the moment, there's still little sign of such a movement in this country, not really a broad mass peace movement, much less a disarmament movement. Nuclear disarmament work remains, for the most part, for the moment, the province of specialized non-governmental organizations. But as I noted at the outset, the conditions for peace and disarmament work going forward are unlikely to resemble those of recent years. Again, we now seem to be coming out of 3 decades of low social mobilization. That period was characterized by single-issue, professionalized, interest group advocacy style politics. Times of low social mobilization lead to a kind of self-reinforcing stagnation. Low rates of political involvement tend towards the proliferation of single-issue organizations staffed by professionals deploying conventional campaigning techniques, litigation, and so forth. Conventional professionals focus on effects rather than on causes, offering incremental technical, legal, and short-term political fixes for problems that the dominant order of things systematically generates. Proposing policy changes that would significantly affect the current distribution of wealth and power in this kind of a time lies beyond the ambit of reasonable and certainly fundable professional activity. And in times of low social mobilization, proposals that would require fundamental social change do appear unreasonable, as only deep, broad social movements can change the boundaries of what is politically possible. So, looking again at the Ban Treaty, it likely was very close to the upper limit of what could be done in disarmament work in a time of low social mobilization. It developed a really good international network of NGOs employing skilled and dedicated campaigners with the support of some friendly governments. It helped to spark a series of high-profile international conferences on the consequences of nuclear warfare. Notably, however, these conferences focused mainly on the effects of nuclear weapons and not on the causes of continued high-tech militarism and renewed confrontations among nuclear-armed great powers. This kind of approach was sufficient to gain the backing of the governments of nuclear weapons-free countries. But without a far broader base of social support, it's hard to make significant disarmament progress in countries where nuclear weapons play a systemic role in military policies, national security ideologies, and also in an increasingly insular top tier of those national economies. So in retrospect, we can see that the Campaign for Humanitarian Conferences and the Ban Treaty was initiated in a different kind of moment than we are inhabiting now. The episodic waves of resistance sparked by the global crisis of 2007 to 2008 and the distinctly inhumane response of most of the Western governments mostly lay in the future. So too did the accelerating tensions among nuclear-armed great powers, and particularly the renewed confrontations in Europe and Northeast Asia. Since that time, those waves of resistance have accelerated the erosion of the established post-World War II political alignments and party structures of the Western nuclear-armed states. The first to take advantage of this interregnum have been authoritarian nationalist forces. Their advocates typically privilege a single national narrative rooted in race, religion, and language. Although the initial beneficiary of this interregnum has been these hard right-wing forces, their rise also is one marker of a return to higher levels of social mobilization, and by stoking resistance across the rest of society has helped to accelerate it. So our starting point for making common cause with the movements for a more democratic, fair, and ecologically sustainable global society will be understanding the common causes driving these developments: the rising risk of war among nuclear-armed states, the ascendance of these authoritarian nationalisms, and the deepening discontent engendered by the accelerating polarization of wealth and income. Ultimately, our future rests on our ability to better understand how efforts to build a fair and democratically controlled economy, to develop sustainable technologies, and to disarm and disassemble the military-industrial complexes of the 20th century can build on and reinforce each other. Now, another point for our work looking forward is trying to think and talk about nuclear weapons in ways that reflect the realities of power. Even disarmament activists who live in nuclear-armed countries often talk about our nuclear weapons. But are they our nuclear weapons? The vast majority of people in nuclear-armed countries have no role in decisions about their nuclear weapons. The decisions by governments to acquire nuclear weapons in every instance are made in secret and are among the least democratic. These secret decisions are made by small numbers of powerful people. And finally, rulers who are willing to risk war among nuclear-armed countries must have an enormously inflated sense of their own significance. They must consider it worth risking the annihilation of the people to preserve the state, to defend the very particular and transitory order of things in which they rule. So it's likely no accident that the most intense resistance to nuclear weapons during the Cold War period arose in a time and a place where the interests of the population supposedly protected by nuclear weapons diverged most clearly from the interests of those who controlled the weapons. And I'm talking about the Euro missile crisis of the early 1980s, in which the United States sought to deploy nuclear intermediate range cruise missiles and also intermediate range ballistic missiles in Western Europe and the United Kingdom. Again, E.P. Thompson, who was a leading figure in the European disarmament movement, posed the question, how does it happen that Britain should find itself committed to policies which endanger the destruction of the entire population as the result of decisions made by a secret committee of NATO, and where the weapons are in the hands of a foreign power whose strategy was basically using Europe as a firebreak for nuclear war to protect the United States? And that question gave rise to other, more fundamental ones. Is nuclear war preferable, Thompson asked, to being overcome by the enemy? Are the deaths of 15 or 20 million people and the utter destruction of the country preferable to an occupation which might offer the possibility, after some years, of resurgence and recuperation? And finally, are we ourselves prepared to endorse the use of such weapons against the innocent, the children, and the aged of an enemy? The people of every nuclear-armed country should be asking these same questions today. And there are other lessons we should have learned by now. No system or country is immune to corruption or collapse. No country can guarantee that a class of leaders will not rise to power who are short-sighted and self-serving and who place their own welfare above that of their people or of humanity itself. No system or way of life is so perfect that its preservation merits risking humanity's future, and thinking it to be so is a form of madness. Recent events may have sharpened our focus on these realities, but they have been true all along. Nuclear weapons are unsafe in any hands. As was the case during the last great wave of disarmament during the 1980s, disarmament movements really, not so much disarmament, our challenge will be to build a new internationalism, one that can appeal across the borders of antagonistic states. And that challenge will be even greater today. We now face a more multipolar world that could generate a number of overlapping confrontations among nuclear-armed countries. In addition, the peace and disarmament movements this time around are going to have to engage more directly with the fundamental economic and political factors driving the renewed confrontations among nuclear-armed great powers. The old blocks are gone, but the vast apparatus of war and repression isn't. These huge military-industrial complexes are even more powerful at home and dangerous abroad in combination with revived nationalisms in the service of competing constellations of capital. If resistance to the renewed militarism of the most powerful governments is to be effective, it must be aligned with none. And Thompson's words on this point at the height of the Cold War still resonate, perhaps the more so as we face two human-caused existential threats: nuclear war and climate change. Only the regeneration of internationalism can possibly summon up a force sufficient to the need. This internationalism must be consciously anti-exterminist. It must embody in its thought, in its exchanges, in its gestures, and in its symbolic expressions the imperatives of human ecological survival. Now, nuclear disarmament work has always posed some distinctive challenges. C. Wright Mills wrote that the human meaning in public issues must be revealed by relating them to personal issues, not to the problems of the individual life, and to the problems of the individual life, sorry. Talking to people about nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War period, my experience has been that most people see nuclear war as a threat akin to the Earth getting hit by an asteroid. It undoubtedly would have horrific results, but they think that the possibility that nuclear weapons will be used in their lifetime is very small, and even more, they think that there's very little that they can do about it. The resurgent antagonisms among nuclear-armed countries, and particularly the events of the last few months, may be raising people's awareness that the danger of nuclear war is real. But most people still think that there's not much they can do about it. Of all public issues, nuclear weapons are likely to be seen as the most unreachable, the province of experts and those privy to secret information. This has been exacerbated again by decades and decades in which there have been few sustained mass social movements in this country. And it's precisely this problem that the Golden Rule Project helps to address in a very concrete way. And that's why I'm really enthusiastic about it. Now, I started this work at a time when the anti-nuclear movement was on the upswing, which is a really long time ago. It was like more than 3 decades ago. And even for people like me, for whom this is really one's life's work, it can be hard in the long post-movement years not to lose hope and not to feel sometimes like we're just going through the motions. And for me, the Golden Rule's visit to the Bay Area just last month was a restorative experience. It was a vivid reminder of what our movements have been able to achieve and might be able to achieve again. And I really hope that the Golden Rule Project will be an example and a seed and just the beginning. This project, with its restoration of a boat that played a dramatic part in the movement against nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s, provides more than just a chance to educate people about the renewed dangers of nuclear war we face today. It provides opportunities to educate people about disarmament movement history. There's an old saying with many variants that history is a series of monuments erected by the victors. But that's true only if we let it be so. Those of us who were participants in the mass peace and disarmament movements of the 1950s through the 1980s need to find every opportunity we can to share that experience with a new generation. And as we move from this long period of low social mobilization into a more active time, the Golden Rule helps us to remember the power of nonviolent direct action and of large numbers of ordinary people acting together. The people who attempted to sail the Golden Rule into the exclusion zone around the US nuclear test site in the Marshall Islands helped to spark a movement against nuclear weapons and nuclear testing that had a real impact beginning in the 1950s and continuing after. It had a concrete victory in the partial test ban treaty that prohibited above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. The Golden Rule and the protest against atmospheric testing were key expressions both of the nascent nuclear disarmament movement and also of the early stages of the environmental movement, sparking exploration of connections among issues that continue down to this day. The Golden Rule Project can grow richer as it goes forward. We can all contribute by exchanging experience and information as it visits our hometowns, building our activist networks, retrieving our movement histories, and by doing so, rebuilding our faith that we can act together to change the world. Thanks.
You know what that means? Go out and buy your Golden Rule t-shirt. I changed, you notice if you were here for the opening, I had the other one, militarization. Fortunately, there's a phone booth out there. You just turn around and it's magic. So thank you, Andrew, for a very enlightening and motivating speech and really setting the groundwork for what we're going to hear next. The Golden Rule. I'm going to introduce to you our own Helen Jaccard. Helen is the staff person that is in charge, really, of making the Golden Rule do what it does. She's sailed on the boat. She spent 3 years at least there now working on the Golden Rule. And she's given talks, as Andrew was talking about, as the Golden Rule has sailed from Eureka beginning this year in its 2017 cruise that will end up in San Diego later this late August or early September. They'll be making many port calls along the way, numerous opportunities to speak about the mission of the Golden Rule, the importance of our campaign, Veterans for Peace campaign. Remember, one of our founding principles is the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons, and this is the personification of that movement. And now we have a real cause to ban the bomb, to enlighten our citizens about the dangers of nuclear weapons in a way that we have not been able to do before. So Helen, thank you, and come on up here and let's tell us more about the Golden Rule.
I want to start out by talking about the new Veterans for Peace nuclear disarmament campaign, because that's the context in which the Golden Rule can now reside. So recently, some of us got together and decided that it was time to really make the Golden Rule part of a bigger campaign within Veterans for Peace, and we talked about some of the things that you see on the initial slide, which is supporting the new United Nations ban on nuclear weapons, supporting the bill that says there shall be no first strike without first having a declaration of war by Congress, calling for no new nuclear weapons. That means no modernization, no upgrades, no nothing. And that has a lot to do with not just weapons manufacturers, but also our national laboratories are very much involved with building new nuclear weapons, developing new nuclear weapons. It means taking our missiles off of hair trigger alert, mostly that's the ground-based missiles, and eliminating the high altitude anti-missile defense system, THAAD, which we've just put in place in South Korea, which upsets the balance of power and eliminates other countries' ability to retaliate. Therefore, the whole deterrence and balance and the possibility of stopping the United States if they did a first strike goes away. So it encourages the United States to drop the bomb first. And finally, another connection between Veterans for Peace and the nuclear disarmament movement has to be recognition of the health of the atomic veterans that were exposed either in the Marshall Islands or at the Nevada test site. So we've got a lot of connections between veterans and these other issues. We have more than just Veterans for Peace involved in this, and we need to always maintain that part of our power comes from coalition with other people. So but within Veterans for Peace, we have, you know, the staff and the board of directors is now supporting this campaign. We have the Golden Rule Committee in Eureka, California. We have all of our supporters and our donors. We have over 2,000 people that are supporting us now. We have our Nuclear Abolition Working Group, which started in 2011, and I look forward to the reinvigoration of that working group. And then the Facebook page has over 50 members as well. So we have people that are already ready, willing, and able to help out with this campaign. All we need to do is help get them coordinated. Okay. Within a campaign, you need to understand the values which are important that will get you to the messaging that will get you to your goals. So we need to treat our veterans right. That includes our atomic veterans. We want environmental justice. That means respecting the indigenous lands and not taking uranium from the lands and poisoning them. We value responsibility, as in don't contaminate the environment. This is originally an environmental issue and still is. Okay? And we value our safety. So, within the context of the nuclear disarmament movement within VFP, we have now the Golden Rule. So this is how she looks today. She's got bright red sails with a Veterans for Peace logo on the main sail and a peace logo on the mizzen, and we try to keep those up as often as possible. This is the way the Golden Rule looked in 1958 during the time of atmospheric nuclear bomb testing in the Marshall Islands, when 4 Quaker peace activists decided that they had no choice but to take nonviolent direct action and try to stop atmospheric nuclear bomb testing by getting in the way and putting their lives at risk. Sorry. So why did they do this in the first place? Well, the original captain of the boat, Albert Bigelow, was shocked by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he decided to quit his commission as a naval officer a month before he could have gotten full retirement pay out of protest of those bombings of Japan. His family also hosted 2 of the Hiroshima maidens who came over from Japan for plastic surgery so that they could live a more pain-free life. And living with them and understanding that they forgave us and that they were happy and learning English and moving on with their lives was deeply affected this crew, the Quakers, and Bigelow's family. And of course, there was the nuclear bomb testing itself, horrible as it was. And think about what it was doing to the Marshallese. You know, they were having children with birth defects, you know, lots and lots of cancers. They still have a lot of children with birth defects. Jellyfish babies, which have transparent skin and no bones. And now, the other existential threat, global climate change, is raising sea levels and the Marshall Islands are disappearing. So as a result of the atmospheric nuclear bomb testing, something that doesn't exist in nature, strontium-90, was blowing all over the place, all over the globe, and was detectable in babies' teeth and bones and in mother's milk and cow's milk. And indeed, some families got Geiger counters so they could test their milk before they gave it to their babies. Before you do a drastic nonviolent direct action like sailing a sailboat into a nuclear test zone, you have to lay the foundation. So you have to have an escalating series of tactics designed not just to accomplish your goals, but if necessary, to educate the public and get this mass movement going, like Andrew was referring to. And this indeed was the case. They did enough letter writing and publishing in magazines and newspapers and held enough demonstrations that by the time they left San Pedro near Los Angeles, they had a huge following. Everybody knew that this is what they were going to do, including the government. So off they went eventually from San Pedro, headed for the Marshall Islands. And in order to get to the Marshall Islands, you have to go through Honolulu. So they stopped in Honolulu. Well, have to stop in Hawaii for supplies. In between San Pedro and Honolulu, the Atomic Energy Commission passed a new rule called the Golden Rule that said that no U.S. citizen shall enter the atomic testing zone. And you can see how huge that testing zone is in the Pacific. The Phoenix, which took over from the Golden Rule in Honolulu and was headed already to Japan, couldn't easily get to Japan without going through that testing zone. As they were leaving Honolulu to go to the Marshall Islands, the Coast Guard caught up with them and brought them back and put the captain in jail. The first mate grabbed Jim Peck and put him on the boat and said, "Okay, we're going." And they brought that team back with a smaller boat. So ultimately, all 5 of them were arrested and spent 60 days in jail. Jim Peck caught tuberculosis in the Honolulu City Jail. So even though their convictions were overturned, or actually they were never convicted, it was an illegal rule to begin with. Interference with international waters is not legal. But this sparked mass protests all over the country and all over the world. So in Honolulu, there were a lot of protests going on, but I talked to people all the time whose first protest they ever went to was when their parents took them to protest to free the crew of the Golden Rule, which I think is way cool. And especially on the West Coast where Dr. Earl Reynolds eventually settled and taught at one of the schools there. Lots of people know the subsequent crew that did make it to the Marshall Islands. So Dr. Earl Reynolds had spent 3 years studying the effects of radiation on children in Hiroshima, and his family was on a 3-year cruise around the world when they came into Alawai Harbor in Honolulu, just a couple of docks down from where the Golden Rule had been, or was at the time, and they heard about this through just local friends and went and attended the trial. And it changed them. What these 5 Quaker activists did changed the Reynolds family forever. And they decided that they had no choice but to take their 50-foot catch and sail it into the nuclear testing zone and complete the protest that the Golden Rule couldn't complete. In 2010, both boats sank in Northern California. The Phoenix is still underwater. The Golden Rule was raised. So this is a picture of right before the Golden Rule sank, right outside of a friend of ours' house. And this is what happened to her, that she was tied to a dock. A gale came along, pounded her against the dock, put a big hole in her side, and she sank. It doesn't look like a boat that you would take across the ocean. Her cabin was destroyed. She was a derelict boat on Humboldt Bay. She didn't have her sails up. She didn't have a motor on her. She was just tied up. And so she was being robbed of her metal, and vandals were coming and destroying her already before she even sank. So what we managed to save was the transom in the back, the hull, and the keel at the bottom. So they hauled her up onto the beach, and Leroy Zerlang, whose boatyard this happened in, called up his friend Chuck DeWitt and said, let's share a bottle of Maker's Mark and have a bonfire using the golden rule. So in addition to facing a watery grave, she faced a fiery grave. But the previous owner, who had allowed her to become so derelict, called up Leroy and said, you know, the golden rule played an important part in ending the Cold War. Maybe you should think about preserving her. So he put her up for sale, and the Smithsonian just about bought her. But along comes a bunch of Eureka people from Veterans for Peace and Quakers and dozens of other supporters. And they said, Leroy, give us a year in your boatyard and we're going to restore this boat. Well, he had an empty spot there, so he said, okay. And 5 years later, we relaunched the Golden Rule. So here's a few pictures of restoring her. She has some extra ribs in her now, just for extra stability. I feel really safe. I'm sitting in my bunk and I put my feet up on the ribs and I'm going, you know, this is a really cool boat. I think it's gonna, you know, keep me safe. So I like it. This is about the time that Jerry and I saw the Golden Rule the second time. She was starting to look like a boat about that point. And in June, we came on the project in February, and in June she launched into Humboldt Bay with great fanfare. A month later, we sailed out of Humboldt Bay, and I got to be crew for the whole first voyage, which was really great. You guys saw me a lot then. So there we are, arriving in San Diego to great fanfare. And on the way back up from San Diego, we made 10 ports of call and gave educational presentation. We got a little more ambitious in 2016, and we did 23 educational events. We did 4 wooden boat shows and 4 water protests. Now, the wooden boat shows are really cool because it really allows you to reach beyond the choir. We had thousands of people visiting the Golden Rule, picking up their brochures and seeing what we were all about. And that's one of the cool things about the Golden Rule is if you're interested in maritime history or you're interested in anything about, you know, old wooden boats, then you might come visit the Golden Rule and you might learn something about nuclear issues today. This was my favorite water action last year, Boats by Bangor. What we did was right at the Bangor Trident Nuclear Submarine Base, which is about 25 miles from Seattle, and also the home to the largest concentration of nuclear weapons in the United States, they hadn't had a water protest since 1982 when the first of the Ohio-class submarines got there. So the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, which was the first sponsor of last year's voyage, got together. They found 14 kayaktivists and a whole bunch of people to be on another boat and a lot of people on shore, and we put 14 people total on the Golden Rule. It's a record. And we went out and we just sailed around, you know, the submarine base in the water. And of course it was well coordinated with the Navy so we didn't get blown out of the water or something like that. Right. I mean, the object is not to get ourselves arrested or the boat seized. The object is to keep educating people. So in addition to reaching the choir, we also talk to local governments. We take people sailing. We participate in local events. That was the Hiroshima Day event on Green Lake in Seattle. We were part of the Indigenous Canoe Journey support, which was an amazing experience. And as I said, we did wooden boat shows. I said races, but we've been in 2 races. It's pretty funny. The Golden Rule doesn't steer real fast because she's a full-keeled boat and very heavy. So this is our voyage this year. Started out in way up there in Eureka, Northern California. We went up the Sacramento River and had a wonderful event in 3 events wonderful in Sacramento. But on the way up to Sacramento, we stopped and visited the site of where the Phoenix is sunk. So it's in the Sacramento River Delta. Now we are in Santa Cruz, and soon we'll be sailing down to Monterey, Morro Bay, Santa Barbara, Marina del Rey, and on to San Diego. Oh, and Long Beach. Okay, so this is just a picture from the reunion of the Golden Rule in the Phoenix, and we had a nice ceremony, said lots of nice words. It was really touching to those of us that have been part of this story for years. One of the things that we did, we have people in the audience that were in the San Francisco Peace Action Camp, which was a way to talk about nuclear issues, to teach people sailing, and to talk about nonviolent direct action. And so Bob, Pete, Hassan, Andrea, and Dominic came out from Tucson. Dan Saint came out from Virginia, and we had a whole bunch of crew members and did a lot of good trainings together. This was a very successful way for us to reach beyond our original boundaries into something new. So this is just talking about the Nonviolence Legacy Project, which the people from Tucson are involved with. So what's for the future of the Golden Rule? This winter or early spring, we intend, if all goes well, to put her on her truck and take her to Texas, where we can start the Grand Loop, they call it. And we want to do the Gulf states, possibly next year ending up in Cuba, we'll see. We want to take 2 or 3 years to go up the eastern seaboard. We want to go through the St. Lawrence Waterway and do all the major cities that are around the Great Lakes, and then down the Illinois and Mississippi river systems back to the Gulf of Mexico. This is going to take a while. This is the intent of the people that started this project in the first place. This is their vision. Extending on that vision is something that might make sense when we get there. When we arrive back in the Gulf of Mexico, it might make sense for us to do a Pacific tour. It might make sense to then go through the Panama Canal, back to Honolulu, onto the Marshall Islands, over to Japan. But then it might make sense while we're over there to talk to some of the nuclear-armed states, right? Korea, China, Russia, before we head over to Alaska and back home. So that's the really long-term vision of what could happen with the Golden Rule. We're concentrating on nuclear weapons right now, but please be aware that in California, we're dealing with the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plants that need to be closed. We're dealing with the San Onofre nuclear fuel rods that are being placed right at the beach in casks that are going to be dissolvable and uninspectable. So we help deal with the nuclear waste issues as well as I'm involved with Clean Up the Uranium Mines project, so we care about the entire nuclear chain. So what can you do to help prevent the possibility of nuclear war? You can join us. You can join the Veterans for Peace Nuclear Disarmament Campaign, and we need lots of help. I'm going to be hanging out near the Monroe Room right outside here starting at 7 o'clock in the morning for the next 3 days, so that if you think you can do some of this work, I want to help coordinate who's going to do what so we can actually make really good progress on getting this campaign going. So one of the things that I think we can do to expand beyond the Golden Rules work is to have something that's easy for chapters to use should they decide to become involved with stopping nuclear war. So we need people to write, we need people to speak and use a good PowerPoint presentation. We need people that will coordinate with indigenous tribes and Japanese and Marshallese. We need people that can do graphics and science posters, things like that. We need singers and artists and musicians. You know, we need event planners. We need people that are good at being in coalition with others. So I envision a resource page from which chapters can go and download the appropriate information, including petitions that we can gather up and take to Congress to support the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty and the Markey-Liu bill against a nuclear first strike. So there we are, sailing for a nuclear-free future.
Hello. Thank you. So, I always get inspired when I hear about the Golden Rule, and I've been on it. But this presentation today with Andrew and the comments made by Helen again about the Golden Rule really re-inspires me about the mission, and I hope it did with you as well. So we've got a few moments here for some questions of the panel members. So I've got this microphone. I'll meet you halfway somewhere. So is there questions here? Okay. Hi, Leah.
Hi, everybody. I personally have a real problem with the Markey-Liu bill because it says that it's against no first use without a congressional approval. Well, for one thing, that bill doesn't need to be written because you have to have congressional approval to launch any war. But it intimates that a second use is acceptable, and it's not. So I don't understand why we're putting our efforts behind that bill. I just think that's a mistake.
Well, sure. Oh, right. It's a step. It's not the end-all, be-all. It's something that we can support. It's not likely to be passed anyway, but it's something that it's something that came from more the grassroots, I believe, because now Trump has his finger on the nuclear trigger and is threatening to use it. And it's what the American people first got upset about when Trump started talking about nuclear issues. And so I think that in general, the US public can support that. But yeah, I agree, it's not okay to say that any use of nuclear weapons is all right. And I do understand why Women's International League for Peace and Freedom chose not to support it, because it implies that it's okay. Yeah, got that.
Okay, do you want to speak? Just state your name and where you're from, please.
I'm Bob Josephs. I'm here from the Joan Duffy Santa Fe, New Mexico chapter. And I'd like... Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm Bob Josephs. I'm here from the Joan Duffy Santa Fe, New Mexico chapter. I'd like to thank you for your presentations. They were both very inspiring and enlightening. And I think I have a question more for Andrew on this one. You mentioned land-based nuclear ICBMs and how destabilizing they are. Do you think there's a possibility as a step forward it would be both in Russia's and our interest to get rid of these land-based systems because of their hair trigger alerts?
Thank you.
Oh, we can just walk up here, walk up and back. The answer is sure, and any step towards reducing alert levels of nuclear weapons also is a step in the right direction. But also a point on this regarding what our work looks like going forward. We're in a period where it's really important to keep the pressure on, and this really applies really to the Liu Markey bill as well to a certain degree. We're in a period where it's really important to keep the pressure on for nuclear disarmament. And the thing that we do as social movements is we really push hard to ask for what we want. And what that does is that moves the boundaries of what's politically possible as the movements get larger and changes the terrain everything else happens on. But, you know, there's been kind of a tendency over the last, you know, in recent years in particular, for there to be a certain amount of friction between the grassroots groups and the arms control groups. And one of the other things we really learned during the Cold War, for example, is that the process of even attempting to negotiate arms control agreements is really important. It has independent value because it's not just like chief executives negotiating. You have 60 people across the lake from the UN in Geneva, you know, diplomats, military people, and so forth, meeting for months at a time. And what this does is it establishes relationships between the nuclear-armed countries. It gives each other a sense of each other's capabilities and also of each other's fears. And it's where the back channels come from that you really, really need in a serious crisis. So while we're pushing for disarmament, we have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to be able to back things that look more modest, like any effort to talk to any nuclear-armed adversary is a good thing, and we should be pushing for it all the time. And we really have to, you know, I would hope, being on the more grassroots end, that the arms control groups in Washington will get a little bit sensitive to this idea that, you know, it's the mass movements that change the terrain of the politically possible, and those usually are self-organizing from the bottom and don't need to be told what to do from the top. And I would also be hoping that all of us can, you know, really value the work of people who are trying to figure out, you know, what are these steps that can keep us from getting blown up in the time that it takes us to get from here to nuclear disarmament.
So, Andrew, with respect to his question about getting rid of the triad land base, what's your view about that? Is that a reasonable step to try to achieve by the powers?
Yeah, well, you know, yes, but again, think about the stuff I was talking about, for example, with the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Those are now becoming another hard target kill weapon. So still, because the land-based missiles are an inviting target, because you can find them and they don't move around, it makes a little bit less of a difference because the United States can most likely destroy a lot of the Russians' command centers and silo-based missiles using submarine-launched ballistic missiles now. But again, any move in the direction of reducing alert levels and so forth is a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Next, would you tell us who you are, where you're from?
My name is Arla from San Francisco, Chapter 69. First, my question is for Andrew, and I want to thank you for your very comprehensive and motivating talk. You mentioned that the new treaty prohibits not only the use of nuclear weapons, but also the threat of use. And I just wondered if you could talk about, what does threat mean? Does that just mean explicit verbal threats, or does it include activity that, like nonverbal activity that could be interpreted as threatening, or what does it mean, or is that yet to be determined? Thank you.
The very strategy and policy of nuclear deterrence rests on a constant threat of the capacity to inflict massive damage on another country. It is an ongoing threat, even if no words are spoken. And again, these are big, complex technologies. I live in California. We have the Vandenberg Air Force Base a few hours from my house, where I sometimes go down and speak at the gate. They test intercontinental ballistic missiles from there. And they say, Bob Work, you know, for example, a Defense Department official says, these tests send a message that we have these weapons, they work, and we're ready to use them. That's paraphrasing, but it's basically what he said. So the policy of deterrence is a policy of continuous threat.
Thank you. Jerry Condon, member of the Board of Directors and President of the Golden Rules Committee. Here.
Yeah, I wanted to thank both of you for great presentations. And I just wanted to say one of the exciting things about the Golden Rule project is it takes a lot of people to make it happen. I mean, it's amazing the really substantial contributions that have been made by scores of people and really hundreds of people, who then become part of this ever-expanding Golden Rule family. And that includes the people who crew the boat. Now, last year's journey, we had like 40 different people crewing at different times. A lot of the people who have crewed the boat have been, including crew and captains, have been members of Veterans for Peace, and there's also non-members involved. And what actually spurred me to think of that is our very first captain on our very first journey of the restored Golden Rule is sitting right over here near me, David Robson from Baltimore Veterans for Peace. Wanted to acknowledge him.
If you like this project, we can teach you to sail. Just remember, there is no excuse. I believe three out of the 4 crew members on that first voyage were over 70. Do not hold back. This is a great opportunity. Your grandchildren will be proud of you, okay? The other thing, in addition to volunteering for crew, is pull out your checkbook. One crew member bought a brand new engine for this boat and has remained anonymous with regard to that donation. People have stepped up and paid up over and over. We need you to speak. We need you to pay. We need you to crew. It feels great.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ray McGovern, and I'm on the advisory board, which is a great privilege here to be there. I have a little background on this, and I'm really glad you defined deterrence and the need to talk, I had the privilege of being involved in the first talks on the first major treaty called SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which were completed in 1972. That's 45 years ago. Oh my God, I just did the subtraction, okay? And I happened to be in Moscow at the time it was signed, when Kissinger and who's that fellow with him? Oh, Nixon came over to sign it. It was a big deal, and as you probably would recognize or confirm, it was the foundation for strategic stability. That's what deterrence was all about. The ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, limited each side to one, well actually originally 2, then it got down to 1 anti-ballistic missile site. Not enough to give either country any assurance that they could escape, that they could, So that was the stability. Now, George W. Bush abolished that treaty. And not only that, but his successors have begun to install anti-ballistic missile installations in places like Poland and Romania and the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And Mr. Putin is understandably really, really upset about that, okay? This could neutralize or give the Pentagon the idea that it could neutralize a lot of the ICBMs that would be in range as soon as these ostensibly defensive missiles become usable as launch pads for cruise missiles that have that range. Now, I just want to say that this is very, very destabilizing. I lived through 1983 when we came really, really close, really close to a nuclear exchange in November of 1983. The atmosphere in those days was exactly the way it is here. It was Reagan, evil empire, Putin, okay? So all I want to say is that things are very labil, as the Germans would say, and this is a very, very good explanation of what we need to do. We need to get off our rear ends, folks. I mean, if we could do it as little children 45 years ago or earlier, we can encourage our young people to do the same thing. And the way we do that is to get out there. And if you have the same color hair as I do, and you get beat up, well, that's really good, guys, because Americans don't like old people to get beat up. They really don't. So it's a big advantage you all have. Put it into play. Thank you very much.
All right. So we're running a little bit late here. I think we can probably take a couple of more questions, and then I'm going to have to allow you to. What's that? Wait. Let's skip. Hold on just a second, Skip. I'll give you 20 seconds. You got it. Another captain.
I was privileged to be the first mate for part of the first voyage. It was the experience of a lifetime. And I just want to say that if you're low income, and I know a lot of our members are, the Golden Rule has a place for you. Think about it. If you join the voyage for, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks, I think 2 weeks is probably about a minimum. We don't need just sailors. We need young, healthy people and poets and photographers and fundraisers and social media. But you're not going to have. You can stay on the boat. How much money are you going to save in San Francisco if you have a place to stay? So it's not. This is a way of social action that doesn't cost you a lot of money. Now we hope you go home to your chapters and do a fundraiser for the Golden Rule to, so we can do all these amazing things Helen's talking about. But we don't want you to think that this is going to be an expensive proposition for your newer, younger members.
Skip. Sally Alice, I think I saw your hand up. Come over here. One of our great members, Sally Alice Thompson. Hi.
I was part of the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament in 1986. And there were about 400 people that made the walk completely across from Los Angeles to New York and down to Washington, D.C. A lot of those people are still alive, and besides the 400 that made the walk, along the way, we involved probably at least 10,000 people. And there must be some way that we can get these people organized to work together. But I don't know how. I hope that people that are more strategically oriented than I am can think of ways to bring together the islands of distrust and dislike for nuclear weapons together to work to form a movement.
All right. So we're running a little late then because of the technical difficulties at the beginning. So everybody has to grab some lunch, and we start again at 1:45. But I'll take maybe 2 more questions. I see this gentleman and that lady over there, and then we'll do it.
Dave Schott, Phil Berrigan Chapter, Baltimore, Maryland.
I'm looking for questions more than comments.
And just, I guess maybe three questions. There was a movie about a nuclear accident in, it was Texas or Oklahoma, a meltdown of a missile, underground missile. I'm just very curious about whether there's knowledge of accidents with these submarines clashing with one another or accidents of this sort. I'm also curious about the cost of maintaining those missiles for a year in Hancock, and finally the damage that one of those warheads. I mean, it's multiple bombs on top of each missile, and curious about that if you have time.
Remember it all?
So the first question is, if you query for Broken Arrow, you'll find out all the various near misses and not so near misses of problems where we've dropped weapons that we didn't intend to out of airplanes and lots of bad things like that. the costs, you might want to look at National Priorities Project and see if they have that per missile. Yeah, a lot of it is secret, and a lot of it's split up into various departments of the military and the rest of the government. Oh, the destructive power of the
multiple
warheads. I
warheads,
mean,
right.
even one Trident nuclear submarine, which we've, as he said, have 8 or 10 out there at any one time, could bring all of human life to an end. So it's too much. Oh, one is too much.
Okay, thank you. One more question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Anna from Kansas City, Missouri. And in Kansas City, we're the home for one of the largest non-nuclear parts manufacturing plants. And right now we're trying to form a coalition of organizations or people to bring awareness to the contamination levels that are involved with the civilian population, the people, the workers, and the people who live around the dump sites, and how it affects future generations, how it affects the genetics. So we're really exploring different ways that we can engage everyday people to understand the contamination that is involved when just in manufacturing the weapons, let alone the even if we were to achieve disarmament, we still have to deal with contamination that will last into a long time. So my question is, how is that a good strategy, and is that something that you guys have experience with? Can we add that to the discussion?
Yeah, it's an immense global problem that stretches back through the whole nuclear fuel cycle to where the uranium is mined and refined and so forth, and the production sites not just in the United States but in all the other nuclear armed countries. There's a long-standing network, which I think you probably know about and may be part of, called the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, that is the organizations that have sort of grown up directly around the parts of the nuclear weapons complex that sustains the weapons, where they're manufactured, the nuclear weapons laboratories, and so on. And yeah, we've been working on these issues for decades. So it's it's a major piece of the puzzle, but it's very important while you're, it's a way to engage the communities, but ultimately you have to remind them this is not a just something left over from the Cold War. This is an ongoing problem, and you have to go to its causes and not just to the effects.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters.